Is Samsung's new 200 megapixel S23 Ultra really that big of an upgrade, or is it all marketing? And how does it compare to the S22 and the S21? Well, I went out, I took a ton of different pictures with all the cameras, different modes. I took a bunch of different video, and today I will show you where I was really disappointed and where I was surprised. Looking at the full shot right here, it's very hard to tell a difference. Now I see a dynamic range difference, but we'll talk about that in just a bit. Cropping in here 400%, I can see that the 200 megapixel shot on the left is the most detailed, but honestly the difference is minimal. In this next shot we have a lot going on. First off, dynamic range, we'll talk about that, but as far as sharpness, it doesn't look much better than the S22 Ultra, so let's crop in, and here we see more of a difference. The S23 looks more natural, less artificial sharpening, and the one that actually looks bad is the S21. Now, do we see a difference when it's all scaled down to 12 megapixel? To me, it looks even more similar than before. Dynamic range is helped for the other ones. Same thing for this shot right here. It's a lot more even with the way most people are going to use it. And cropping in, to my surprise, the S22's 108 megapixel actually looks more detailed when scaled down to 12. Now I took more shots, but the results are basically the same, which is a little bit unfortunate. Now I'm also going to be comparing the 200 megapixel to Apple's 48 megapixel Pro RAW, so make sure you guys are subscribed. But where I did start to see more differences and changes was when it got darker. Now in this shot, not a huge difference other than the S21 starting to fall behind. The same thing in here. The S23 looks slightly better than the S22, but the S21 looks bad. In this shot, the S21 has some smearing, it's a little bit soft, and honestly, I think the S22 looks the best. Once again, the S21 is falling behind here, and the other two are almost identical. Now when it really gets dark, the S23 starts taking the lead like in this shot, but I also noticed that it can have some different kind of flaring that's more noticeable in certain shots, like this one on the left hand side. And here, honestly, I think the S22 looks the best. And the same thing here, the S22 looks great. Now, people had concerns that the shutter lag is going to be too bad with the sensor, but honestly, it did great in my testing. Now, one issue I did find is that sometimes when it's really dark, the new S23 will push up the shadows way too much, especially in this shot right here, where it doesn't look like daytime, but doesn't look like nighttime. I think they gotta update the software. Now, it doesn't always happen, so it's sometimes hit or miss. Here, the image looks great and better than the other two. But another issue I found is banding and artifacting. The S22 looks solid. The S21 has a lot of noise, but the S23 has this weird color noise and banding. You could see it at the top left in the darks in this shot as well. And in this shot as well, even on the ground there. Overall, when this kind of stuff happens, the S22 definitely takes the win. Now setting these up on a tripod, the S23 gets a lot more detail, better shadows, the water looks nicer. It is a great shot. These were at 200 megapixel, but they downsampled. And here, this is a 30-second exposure. It was pitch black. It's amazing what these phones could do, but I prefer the S22. Honestly, I think the S23 needs another 6 months or so with new software updates, or maybe closer to a year before the hardware is fully realized, because the sensor seems good, but we have a lot of inconsistencies. Now, testing out the ultra wide in the daytime, there is literally no difference. They look so similar. It's only at nighttime where the S23 starts coming ahead depending on the shot. Now, in some shots, the S22 actually looks better. It just looks a little bit sharper, a little bit more contrast, but the S21 really starts to fall apart. The same thing here. The other two are fairly close, a little bit more detail in the S23 here, but the S21, if you have one of those, you should probably upgrade. Now, as far as 10x telephoto, can we see a difference? Well, honestly, it's quite hard. When you're looking at all the feathers, they look so similar in daytime. Here, I think the S22 looks a little bit better. I think it just might be because of extra contrast being added. We have slight differences in color, but in terms of detail, looks so similar. Now, in nighttime, we start seeing a difference. We have less noise, a little bit more detail. Getting even darker, the difference is even more noticeable. It's definitely an improvement. But looking at this classic moonshot we like to do, the quality is the same or slightly worse. Looking at this 3X, the detail looks practically the same. I just see a little bit improvement in processing with dynamic range. Same thing here, but the S21 was just misfocusing on multiple shots. I want to see if we have a difference in detail at night, since that's what we're kind of seeing. And here, not a big difference in detail, but the S22 pushed up the mids too much. And here, they look fairly similar, but the S23 has a little bit more detail in the face, a little bit better processing. Now, one thing I did see is a difference in motion blur. Here, the S21 looks the best. It had the fastest shutter speed. In this shot, the oldest and newest look good, with S23 taking the win, but the S22 is suffering from motion blur, and the same thing here, motion blur on the S22 3X, but the S23 looks the best, and the S21 looks the worst with a lot of noise, which is apparent in multiple different shots. So as far as 3X, I would give it to the S23, but not by a huge margin over the S22. Next, we're gonna look at portrait shots, which I love taking. The S22 is pretty good, but it was behind the iPhone, and with the 200 megapixel sensor, is that gonna make it better or worse? I was hoping for some better processing for portraits, and it looks slightly different, a little bit more contrast, but not by that much. The edge detection looks to be very similar, maybe even slightly worse than the S22, but we have better white balance and a little bit better HDR as well, a little bit more contrast, but it's not really worth upgrading for. What is worth upgrading for is if you like taking wide portraits. Here, only the S22 could take one at this distance, and the same thing here at nighttime. It was able to do a portrait shot where the others weren't, and it looks surprisingly natural. And just like before, we start noticing a bigger difference when you're taking night mode portraits. You get a little bit more detail, a little bit better contrast, less noise. So the difference is noticeable, but once again, I wouldn't upgrade just for a little bit more detail. Now let's flip around to the selfie cameras. For some reason, Samsung went from a 40 megapixel selfie camera down to a 12 on the new one. Maybe cost savings, I don't know, but that is weird because they went with 200 on the back. So let's go ahead and take a look. One thing that kept coming up for selfies is that sometimes the darks are just pushed up too much. It makes it look a little bit flat. Now with really good bright lighting, the difference is very minimal between the S22, and both of them look sharp. But in more even indirect lighting, you start getting those grays coming up and you see less detail. The same thing at night. The S22's 40 megapixel camera definitely looks better, but the S21 looks the worst. So yes, unfortunately, I would say that the selfie camera downgrading to 12 megapixels did make it worse overall. As for the macro, well, the S23 struggled to focus and to take the shot. The S22 did the best, being able to get close, and when you're doing the same distance, it just looks sharper overall. Now the next section is what surprised me the most and where I saw the biggest improvement with the S23 that might make it worth upgrading for some of you. Now where I noticed a big difference is dynamic range. Now this is the portrait shot right here, and the S21 allows a 2x, which I like, but the dynamic range is way worse. This shot right here wasn't as crazy, so it's not as noticeable. But here, the S23 isn't blowing out any of that platform or the building in the background. It definitely looks the best. Here, it pulls down the sky nicely and the light bulbs aren't distracting like on the S21, and the faces look nice and clear. And with that, the white balance is more accurate as well, with a little more detail and a nice pleasing dynamic range. Now at nighttime with a bright screen, you guys see the difference. This shot might be even more clear where the screen is fully visible compared to the other two. Running a longer night mode shot, you also see the difference. And with neon signs, my goodness, it's the only one that can get the color right. You have less noise than the S22 and a lot more detail. Now switching to that 3x lens, the S22 looks terrible, whereas the other two look pretty good, but dynamic range is the best on the S23. Here's another example right here. It's a pretty massive difference. We see the same thing with the ultra wide. The image just looks really nice on the S23. And with the 10x lens, I mean, look at that. Nice sharp image, nothing blown out. The S21 looks like garbage. So to me, the biggest improvement in camera quality is dynamic range. Look at that, the S23 looks amazing. It has the sky details of the S22 and the subject details and brightness of the S21 looks amazing. And in this 30-second exposure on a tripod, I mean, the difference is startling at 200 megapixels. So overall for camera quality, even though 200 megapixels doesn't give us a big difference in the daytime, I think the sensor is a lot newer, has faster readouts, so Samsung can get better dynamic range. It gives some improvements in certain night mode aspects, and you guys saw that last shot, it was very impressive. So overall, is it a sucky update like some people are saying? I would say it's an iterative upgrade that they're trying to sell as a revolutionary upgrade. But with that said, what about video? I shot a bunch of different modes. I shot 8K. Let's go ahead and take a look. Starting out with portrait video. Now it's the only one that could do so in a higher resolution, and the S21 has bad dynamic range, bad quality, it's wider, but it looks quite a bit worse, so definitely an improvement. And it's also the only one that can record portrait with objects, which is also really nice. Now as far as slow motion, you actually get an upgrade in camera quality. It's doing this, I believe, in 4K instead of 1080p. So we do have some improvements, but it's not massive other than some extra sharpness. Here we also have a little bit more detail, a little bit better dynamic range for this slow motion. Not massive, but it is noticeable. As far as super slow motion, it can now do so at a higher resolution. Look at that extra sharpness and detail. It is definitely nice. The water looks more natural, but unfortunately, both S23 and S22 record clips that are half the length of the S21. So I had a really hard time trying to get this shot with other two. Now this is 8K through some glass, so we do have some reflections. Now the first thing you'll notice is it's quite a bit wider. As far as detail, it doesn't look that much better, but dynamic range and the highlights are pulled back quite a bit better. This is where the 8K really impressed me. Once again, look at the difference in how much wider the 8K is now. It used to be really cropped. Not only that, we have less noise, we have better dynamic range. The detail of the 8K also looks better. Now I cropped it in so that the framing is the same. And even with zooming in, it still looks quite a bit better and more usable. So 8K is now a reality. Switching over to 4K, we have a little bit extra contrast and detail. I was worried about artifacts because of such a large sensor, but Samsung is doing a good job. The image is improved. And another tall shot over here with less reflections. Dynamic range is slightly better. It looks a little bit flat right now, but even for 4K, we're not seeing any issues with such a large sensor.
And this is front-facing camera comparison. On the left side, we have On the left side, we have the S21 Ultra, middle S22 Ultra, and on the right, S23 Ultra.
Testing out the super smooth footage, the S23 can actually have a higher resolution. It's about 1440p now. Here I'm walking and I'm trying to walk with a lot of shakiness, and the difference isn't huge. Now I did go inside, and I'm glad that I did, because look at all of that noise on the S23. The S22 looks a bit better, and the S21 has a lot more contrast, so it hides the noise. So even though we have higher resolution, the actual video, if you're in mid to low lighting, looks quite a bit worse. Now, recording 8K footage at nighttime with some decent lighting around, so it's not crazy dark, it also looks just so good. Way more closer to photo quality than before. We have less stuttering, a lot more detail, less noise, and a much wider shot. So now I would actually use the 8K. This is incredible. So even though we do have some downgrades in terms of video because of higher resolution or things like that, overall I say it's a major win, especially because the 8K is such a big improvement. The dynamic range is a bigger improvement. It's actually usable, and if this was my daily driver, I would be shooting in 8K all the time. So if you care about the best quality video, I would say it's amazing. And now I have to compare it to the iPhone, which has been the video quality king for a long time. So there you guys go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I did a super detailed look. Were you impressed by the S23 Ultra's camera upgrades? Or do you think it is not that big of a deal? Go ahead and click that circle above to subscribe. Check out one of those videos right over there. This has been Max, and I'll see you in the next one.